The stories behind rock and roll's history-making drummers and what makes them so great, including Ringo Starr, Charlie Watts, John Bonham, Dave Grohl, and more, coming up next on Booked on Rock.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. John Lingan is our guest. His brand new book titled Backbeats, A History of Rock and Roll in 15 Drummers. John, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Thanks so much for having me, Eric. I'm doing great.
5-star reviews across the board on Amazon. And among the compliments is that it's written for musicians while also connecting with those who are not musicians, but music fans. And there's a great comment from one reader who said, quote, "As a steering wheel drummer with no musical training and little sense for the history of drumming, this was a compelling, entertaining, informative, utterly delightful read." You got to love reading those reviews.
Yeah, that kind of message in particular is really great because that was certainly like a secondary goal of the book. Really was, I was sort of talking to a friend, another writer, in the course of writing it, who brought this idea to my attention. So it wasn't like an original thing, but just like the idea that a book like this, there aren't that many general interest books about drums, period, regardless of whatever the topic is or whatever. And so like, I wanted this book to not only be like a history of rock and roll, like it says on the cover, but also if it's a person's like first introduction to like thinking about drums for 250 pages or whatever, I want it to be approachable like that. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful compliment. That's why there's a glossary in the front. That's why I commissioned a wonderful illustration of a drum set that's in the book as well. Because yeah, I thought like it's a good story, but for many people, this will probably be the first time they ever think at this length about something they've listened to their whole lives.
15 drummers covered in the book. So what goes into your choice of 15 drummers?
Well, once I decided that the organizing principle was going to be a history of rock and roll. So, as opposed to a list of the 15 greatest drummers or something like that, then that sort of helped me build out what that list was. And I didn't have at the time when I decided, okay, it's going to be this particular history, I did not have a number in mind. So then it became an idea of like, okay, well, how many different like branches on the tree of rock and roll do you sort of need to explore for this to be a halfway, just like comprehensive history of this genre, which, started in the 40s or the 50s, depending on who you talk to, and continues to this day. So like, how many different sort of roads do you have to travel down? And I thought 10 was too little. 20 was sort of like becoming too many. 15 was ultimately, but just picked for no reason, honestly, kind of arbitrary, but it did cover enough ground. And so then I became like, okay, well now I want there to be like, not necessarily the best, although I think these are all fantastic players and I love their playing, but it's not a list of the best. It's more a list of like, okay, if we're going to talk about this particular subgenre or this particular development in rock and roll, who is the sort of like the best stand-in for that? Who is the drummer that best exemplifies that particular thing? And so then it became like, okay, how many of these different steps do I want to go along, and then who's going to be the exemplary player for each of these sort of subgenres?
Yeah, and I want to ask you about some of those drummers, but this is the list of 15. Sam Lay, Hal Blaine, Al Jackson Jr., Ringo Starr, Charlie Watts, Kenny Buttrey, Mo Tucker, Clyde Stubblefield, John Bonham, Bernard Pretty Purdy, Earl Hudson, Tony Thompson, Dave Lombardo, Dave Grohl, and Questlove.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's the list.
It's a hell of a list. Well, let's start with Sam Lay. He performed the best blues musicians ever: Muddy Waters, Little Walker, Howlin' Wolf, Paul Butterfield, John Lee Hooker, Bo Diddley. You write, quote, Lay wanted to be an athlete, a sprinter like Jesse Owens, but he loved music and seems to have been born for the drums, even if he never touched a pair of sticks as a kid. Talk about Sam's background, how he ended up becoming a drummer.
Yeah, he's a great example of a person who sort of comes to the instrument from a sideways perspective, which is, like I say, as you read right there, not a musician growing up, although he was in a church in Birmingham, Alabama, a sort of gospel style black church, very musical and very percussive, lots of hand clapping and even a certain like rudimentary drum set in the congregation. So very rhythmically inclined, but did not think of himself in those terms as a maker of music whatsoever. Then he goes, like a lot of Black people, millions of Southern Black people, as part of the Great Migration, he moves up to Cleveland and then Chicago, and it's in Cleveland. And he arrives like right around the time that Alan Freed is a rock and roll DJ, sort of using that term famously for the first time. Lay wasn't interested in that. He watched jazz music in clubs there, and then he listened to blues music, which was becoming the sort of urban Black music of the time, as opposed to it being the sort of the country blues tradition of a generation earlier. So he gets into that, and then plays for the first time in Chicago just because he sort of moved, or I'm sorry, in Cleveland, because he sort of then moves to Chicago, and that's the epicenter of electric blues. That especially at that time, Chess Records was up and swinging, absolutely. And so yeah, he plays with Little Walter. Doesn't record with Little Walter, but then moves on and works and records prodigiously with Howlin' Wolf. And and then, as you say, a sort of list of the greatest ever. And then eventually with even in the 60s for a time with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and that's how he ended up with Bob Dylan even. So yeah, it's just a tremendous legacy. And to me, like a guy that you pick that you want to highlight in this history, because he really shows this transition, this movement from the blues as a sort of like regional Black music into the mainstream, into the, let's call it co-option or whatever you want, acculturation of it by younger white people, and then its movement into the ultimate mainstream with something like Bob Dylan and his performance at the Newport Folk Festival. So to me, a character like that who moves through so many things and connects so many different kinds of music is really that's what I wanted to really highlight in a book like this.
There's a comment from Corky Siegel, a harmonica player, talks about Sam playing the full dynamic range all the time. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on that? What made Sam Lay so unique?
This is one of those things. I'm grateful that you brought that particular quote up, because this is one of those things that, like we were saying earlier about people who know music but maybe don't know drums, is that I've talked to a lot of people in writing this book who think of drums and drumming as just sort of like, oh, it's like timekeeping. But dynamics, and what we talk about is the sort of like the variations in volume that players have, that drummers have, are hugely important to drums, and also to the sort of historical development of drums. Throughout this book, you see examples of different people, different players who introduce like a sort of wider dynamic range in different ways. And Lay was the same way, because it wasn't, rather than just like a boom clap boom clap boom clap, sort of blues backbeat like that, he was able to sort of add these little ghost notes of like boom bop boom bop boom bop boom. And so like that little variation, that little change in there just gives it a deeper feeling that, again, I think a lot of people don't necessarily even pick up on, but musicians, people like Corky Siegel, certainly do, and certainly always have.
So many people know about the Wrecking Crew, top-notch session musicians based in Los Angeles who played on many studio recordings in the 60s and the 70s, including hundreds of top 40 hits. And among that crew, drummer Hal Blaine. Really interesting to read that the guy who's among the greatest studio musicians ever was primarily a live nightclub drummer into his late 20s. What led him to studio work?
What led him to studio work was the creation of rock and roll studio work. Like when a guy like Hal Blaine, who I believe was born in 1929, but late 20s, early 30s. So when he makes the decision, or a person his age makes the decision they want to become a professional musician, it's the big band era. It's like that's what being a professional musician is. It's like playing jazz music, ideally playing with a famous singer in supper clubs, which is exactly what Hal did. Suddenly, by the late 50s, you've got this growing, what people thought was just going to be a trend towards music for teenagers, pop music. And you even have certain, record makers, people like Phil Spector, who are creating an entirely sort of new way and approach and sound for this music. And, so again, it's like what led to that opportunity was suddenly that opportunity existed. And then for him, everyone has lucky breaks, of course. He met one of the other earliest session musician, like rock and roll drummers, an incredibly important drummer in this story, although he's not one of these 15 that get their own chapter, but this gentleman named Earl Palmer, who also his transition was from playing New Orleans rock and roll like Little Richard. Then he went to Los Angeles. So by the time the two of them met, suddenly there's this big Los Angeles record making culture that's turning their eye and is like, hey, we got to capitalize on all these young people buying records, but none of the old jazz playing farts know how to play this stuff. So guys like Earl Palmer and Hal Blaine knew how to play this newfangled music, and that's why they sort of like built such grand careers in it for so long.
You read the book, quote, Hal's most famous and influential performance, his ticket to immortality, was a beat so simple that its signature element is an unplayed snare. And you're referring to the song Be My Baby from 1963 by the Ronettes. If you could talk about that opening where he leaves out the first snare and how producer Phil Spector relied on Hal to propel the drama throughout that track.
So this is the famous boom, 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 bop, boom, 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 bop. So like there's different tellings of like how this happened, whether it was like Hal made this decision to leave, because typically a beat like that would be boom, bop, boom, boom, bop, boom. And that would have a very different, more upbeat kind of and more typical kind of pattern to it. So by leaving out that first snare, it makes that second one just like hit so hard, and it also slows down the tempo of the entire song and creates this sense of like tension even within the rhythm part. And of course that song is all about building up and releasing tension. So there are different quotes you can find about whether that was Hal's decision or someone told him in the studio to leave that part out. But either way, that's a great example of one of those drum beats that everybody knows. I mean, it's been repurposed dozens, if not hundreds of times in all sorts of contexts, whether by the Beatles or the Jesus and Mary chain, or just like Bruce Springsteen. There's so many examples of that beat. It's almost its own sort of like genre of rhythm. Like certain things are, like we have certain beats that are just kind of canonical, like a Cuban clave beat or a disco 4 on the floor beat, something like that. And that's absolutely what Be My Baby is. It's like it's its own feel unto itself at this point.
Yeah, another project I want to ask you about is his work on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds.
Mm-hmm.
He's using orange juice bottles, a water jug, a mallet, but it's not just his ingenuity. You write about how his ability to read other instruments and adjust on the fly that made him the perfect guy to translate Brian Wilson's vision. Brian wasn't a trained composer, right? So the average musician would have trouble with how he wrote the charts, which wasn't, I guess, technically the way they normally would have been written.
So again, like to talk about Hal, because again, people 10 years younger than him, maybe even less, might come up in a different way as drummers and have like a more rock and roll feel. He, as we say, jazz trained, literally went to music school. So this guy knew composition. But there's also a great quote that I did not get out of anybody, but I found it somewhere, describing him in the studio and how like the people in the studio would laugh because his drums sounded terrible in the room. And as you might expect, playing orange juice bottles would also sound terrible, or doing all these other sort of almost sound effect kitschy kind of things that he added to tons of tracks. His genius and like the significance of him in the story of rock and roll is that he was one of the first drummers to conceive of their role as like existing inside the studio. His job was to play and get it to sound good through microphones. It wasn't to get it to sound good live and like in the room or live in a club. It was to use whatever thing. He just like had a way to understand not only how to translate, he was able to translate both like, into the more complex, like theoretical compositional side, and was able to bridge that with this just like totally free-for-all creative studio environment that was only being invented at the time by guys like Spector and Brian Wilson.
So he had an idea of what it was going to sound like coming out of the other side.
Yeah, and he had no ego about it. He was like, I want to add something to this thing. I think we can get this sound by dinking on water bottles or dinking on orange juice bottles. And like, a person who takes themselves more seriously or thinks of their job as being more of an artiste might not make those kinds of connections. But that's a great kind of rock and roll spirit that this guy born in the 1920s was really able to embody at the time. Terrific. And
an aside, a phenomenal drummer, but somebody in the book was talking about, the guy just had great looks. He had the nicest eyes.
It was Earl Palmer, who just like out of nowhere, because he has an autobiography that's sort of like built on interviews with him. That's called Backbeat, actually. In that book, he just like sort of out of nowhere drops this great quote that like, Hal Blaine had the prettiest eyes.
Eyes. Hypnotic eyes.
Look him up. He had a smolder. Earl wasn't wrong.
The Booked on Rock podcast is part of the Boneless Podcasting Network. If you're a fan of classic rock and classic film like I am, go to boneless.lovable.app to find over 20 great shows there. That's boneless.lovable.app. Or just go to bookedonrock.com, click on the logo. It'll take you right to the Boneless Podcasting Network. It is what you want it to be. Listen with confidence. Ringo. Boy, Ringo's influenced many of the greatest drummers, yet doesn't get the notice musically that the other members get, in my opinion, because, of course, we're talking about John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. But you bring up a great point in the book. His ability to adapt to the unprecedented and unforeseen musical challenges throughout the Beatles' recording career is astonishing. And people don't talk about that. I've never heard anybody mention that, but think about that, how he had to keep up with those massive changes and advancements in what those guys were doing with the music. So talk about Ringo, what makes him such a good drummer, and what other drummers mean by him having a great feel.
Yeah, you mentioned that thing about him being like the sort of the lesser Beatle to everybody, and sort of being musically taken for granted, and it being this, a sort of joke for many years. That Ringo like wasn't a good drummer or something like that. And I do feel like the record has been corrected there, but there's this way that people talk about him in terms of what he did not do, in terms of like, oh, he was so like patient and like didn't mess up rehearsals or recordings. He didn't play very much, or he had this very sort of spare style. And I wanted to really showcase like those are true, but like he was a masterfully creative player. And I think the way to understand that is to really look at like what this guy had to do over the course of 8 years. Early 60s, and it wasn't like they plucked him from obscurity. Early 60s, he joins the Beatles 1962. He's a very well-known percussionist and a revered one in Liverpool and in Hamburg. So they knew who he was and like were excited to get him in the band. Then they become insanely popular, and suddenly this guy who's used to playing in tiny little club settings is playing on TV sets, and he's playing at these massive concert halls. And within, before too long, he's playing at Shea Stadium. He's playing at Candlestick Park, and like these are not great environments to be a drummer. You can't hear yourself. Sound equipment was at the same time, so they break it off. They stop and they focus only on recording. And then, so you think about that, he starts as this great live rock and roll drummer, completely loses the plot in terms of like what he brings to the band as they blow up. Then they retreat to the studio in a way and become super creative. And his role in the group at that point completely changes from, they hire him in 1962 to be this like great energy boost. And now he's the guy who's sitting still as they work out things in the studio and they record orchestral parts and all these other things. And damned if Ringo didn't play some of the most creative parts during that whole time period. It wasn't like he just sort of like drifted into the background. He played amazing parts in every single Beatles recording. And you can look at like all these different examples of just like wildly creative beat making and approaches to that instrument in a musical way, but also just like in a fascinatingly rhythmic way. So yeah, that was a hard chapter because it's hard to write anything new about Ringo at this point or anything new about the Beatles at this point. But yeah, to find it, at least try it, I had to just sort of put myself in his shoes and think about what that was like to be on that journey for so long. And it's even more incredible than I considered it before.
Charlie Watts, so glad he's in this book. I love Charlie Watts. Actually, grew to love him and his sound more and more as the years went by. So essential to the Rolling Stones sound. You're right, quote, no one else has a backbeat like Charlie Watts. Explain why Charlie was so unique in that sense.
Yeah, totally unique in the sense of that band, especially as they went on and they entered that sort of like mythic period, Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed up through Exile on Main Street. I mean, I'm Not Alone. That's my favorite of their music. And so like the whole sort of what they achieved in that time was this just sort of amazing looseness where the guitars are kind of snaking between each other and the reverb is forming part of the stew. And like, they got background singers and Mick Jagger shaking things. And it's just like this big, and like what Charlie Watts did was like keep that really steady, and not just in a timekeeping way, because he was honestly not a great time. I mean, he was like he sort of shifted and moved that it was a loose band. They shifted and changed the tempo from time to time, but as a sort of calm in the storm and a just sort of like keeping a kind of like jazz influence and just like steadiness in the midst of that. Just like the equivalent of just an absolutely flawless rhythm guitar player, just like never made a song, always made a song better when he played on it.
Yep. I was fascinated at the part about Charlie's snare sound really being a mix of sounds. Can you explain how he came up with that?
So again, I love to be asked these kinds of questions because these are things that I did want to sort of highlight in the book, is these sort of like physical aspects of drumming. So the Charlie Watts backbeat, if you think of like a drumstick, sort of tapers to a sort of bead at the end. And if you think of a drumstick hitting a drum, you would think of like that bead making contact with one area of the drum. And then like as it hits that drum and you lift off from it, then the air in between those two, heads, as we say, reverberate, and that's what makes a drum. A snare drum, of course, is tuned super tight and it has these like snares on the bottom, so it doesn't reverberate. but as much, but it still does reverberate a little. And one way that you can get it to reverberate more is to sort of simultaneously hit the bead on the head as well as the sort of middle part of the stick on the metal rim, and that's called a rim shot. So you get this sort of like it's like a tighter sound, but it also makes the drum vibrate more. So he was great at that, and he was great at like, and again, talk about those dynamics that we were talking about with Sam Lay. He was the master at like his backbeat was super steady, but each one would sound different in certain ways because sometimes he'd hit us. Sometimes he'd hit it in a different part of the drum. Sometimes it'd be a rim shot, and it just gave it this like, as I say, this depth, this dynamism of the sound in a way that like Ringo, for example, we think of his playing as being very like boom, boom, very like very tight, contained, and Charlie's was much more reverberative and even in his snare, which is just an amazing thing to achieve. And he's like, you can tell him from the moment you hear him.
So he's utilizing every part of the stick, every part of the kit.
Yeah. He's hitting it so that it's not just the head of the drum reverberating and the air going back and forth between the top and bottom there, but it's also because you get the click sound of that wood hitting metal on the drum hoop, and then you've also got this greater reverberation that you hear because the wood of or the metal in a snare's case is reverberating more because you're slamming a bigger, like more of the stick on it. And so again, would you notice this? Like, is this the kind of thing that like a normal non-obsessive listener is going to necessarily notice? No, not really. But if you're the kind of person, it's the equivalent of like how a guitar player, like what effects they use, or just what sort of like if you have reverb up, if
Sure.
you've got a little echo, it's just like it's how to get a little bit more voice, a little bit more life into the sound you're making. And yeah, he was just like I say, was really one of the masters of that for sure.
But now that you point this out, whenever we listen to the Stones now, listen closely.
Mm-hmm.
See if you can hear it. I think you mentioned in the book too, the Stones, the shows get bigger and bigger. The stage gets bigger and bigger, and it's these huge backdrops of it. Yet throughout, right up until the end, Charlie had the same kit.
And an old one.
The
too.
old kit.
There's the great quote from Gina Schock of the Go-Go's, who I did talk to and who did say this to me. But so they opened for the Stones in their 1981 tour, which was the first rock and roll tour to take place exclusively in athletic stadiums. So this is they filmed it for a concert movie called Let's Spend the Night Together, and so they're playing in like Tempe. They're playing in a giant like 70,000 person football bowl. And she said the quote was that she was talking to Charlie's roadies and they were laughing that like the oriental rug underneath of his kit was worth more than the drums itself.
Yes. It's so great.
And
And
it's terrific.
by the way, the best dressed drummer in rock and roll history.
It's those Savile Row suits. And it's like, again, big time jazz guy, like so many people of that era. And he really, that was the sort of standard that he set for himself in a lot of different ways, including
impeccably
dress.
dressed. Yes.
Always.
John Lingan, the author of Backbeats, A History of Rock and Roll and 15 Drummers. John Bonham, Bonzo, great quote from Robert Plant. You include in the book to describe Bonzo's steadiness on the bass pedal. Jimi Hendrix was blown away by it. And Robert said to Jimmy after the show, he's like a rabbit.
He's like a rabbit. Yes. If I'm breaking any news in this book, I do believe that is an original Jimi Hendrix quote that Robert Plant shared with me when I interviewed him.
Don't recall ever hearing that before.
Yeah, it was such a fascinating anecdote because of course Plant has amazing, insightful things to say about Bonzo's playing, but Jimi Hendrix is like, he's not just a guitar player, like he's the guitar playing genius. And so it's like the idea of a guy with that level of sort of instrumental command watching Led Zeppelin early in London, and then immediately the first thing he wants to talk about isn't Jimmy Page. He wants to talk about the drummer. I think that really embodies kind of what Bonham brought to that instrument. It was just like he was, kind of a Hendrix equivalent, in many ways.
Sure. He played ghost notes on the bass drum without sacrificing intensity or energy. For those not familiar, what is a ghost note and what made Bonham so good at that?
A ghost note is just sort of the technical term, as we say, for those kind of those sort of half hits in between the main backbeats. So instead of that like boom bop doing the boom bop boom bop boom bop boom, it's that like that sort of echo. It's just, as they say, they call it the ghost because it's just the sort of like tail. So any kind of like, as we say, like that's one of those ways to get that variance and intensity and in volume really that drummers can use. And so a lot of people can do that on their hands or with one hand. And Bonham was really one of the first people to do that with his bass drum foot. And you can hear that right off the top, side one, track one, on the Led Zeppelin self-titled album. Good Times, Bad Times. You can hear like his entrance when he comes in with the funny little hi-hat thing. And then he does this, like once Plant comes in, he does these great little like triplet, almost like boobada kind of movements on the bass drum. And similar to how people reacted to Hendrix, that's just one of those like people in the club are going to look at that and just be like, oh my God, who the hell is this guy? That's just like a real path-breaking new kind of way to blow people's minds with the drum set in 1968.
I remember reading about the song Rock and Roll, and Bonham intentionally messed with it a little bit so anybody that was going to do any cover band that was going to try to do it would have difficulty with it. And that reminds me of the Hal Blaine thing with like, where's he going with this at the start of the song?
Right.
You're not sure when he's going to come in when hit the bass pedal.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's so hard because I believe what you're referring to is there's the great song Rock and Roll starts with a drum intro. And from the way he plays it, you like find yourself going like, here comes the entrance of the whole band, and you're always wrong. And I believe that's because he actually starts the fill on beat 2 of a measure. So it's like an 8-beat, a 2-measure phrase, but he starts on the 2. So it's a 7, it's like a 7-beat fill instead of what you would expect to be an 8-beat fill. Just an example of that. And I think he was conscious from the start that like he had the kind of style that people were going to be kind of mesmerized by, and I don't think he was in any way like worried about people nicking his moves or anything like that, but I can definitely imagine him being like, oh, I'll make it harder in a playful sort of way to ape my style. Yeah.
Hey guys, we'll get back to the show, but first I want to tell you about an exclusive deal for Booked on Rock listeners. Get 15% off any purchase at oldglory.com. Over 300,000 officially licensed items covering music, sports, entertainment, and pop culture. Merchandise featuring legendary music artists like Bob Marley, The Beatles, Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and many, many more. Go to oldglory.com. Make sure to use the promo code BookedOnRock. Also find a link in this episode's show notes, or just go to bookedonrock.com and click on My Deals. Tony Thompson, another legendary session guy who doesn't get the acclaim deserved, I don't think. Best known for his work with Chic and the Power Station. Mm-hmm. And on the Power Station, that album, he sounds just massive. I mean, that's like When the Levee Breaks is Bonzo's famous one for the monster beat, but the Power Station is one of those big beat albums.
Absolutely. And who agreed with you was Robert Plant and Jimmy Page, because when Zeppelin reunited at Live Aid in 1985, Thompson was the guy they came to replace John Bonham. And like you would think, 35-year-old black guy I think he's from the Bronx, plays with Chic. He plays the incredible drum intro on I'm Coming Out by Diana Ross. So like massive killer drummer, but you wouldn't think replaces John Bonham. It's just not the same kind of style, but it's a fascinating thing. And this is what I loved about sort of putting this book together was sort of highlighting these types of, when you look at drums this way and you sort of follow where influences go, you make these connections that you might not otherwise. So like, for example, Tony Thompson, as I say, black kid from the Bronx, born in the 60s, massive Zeppelin fan. He like idolized Bonham above anybody, but also idolized Ginger Baker and these other incredible players from that time. So this great big snare drum, you know, and this very classical 80s sound that you associate with something like the Power Station, you know, we think of that as being this like, you know, mid 80s sort of synth pop sound, but again, came straight from Led Zeppelin, like so many things. You know, you wouldn't find those connections if you were trying to find them through Jimmy Page or Robert Plant, but through the drums, it comes through loud and clear.
Yeah, there was a quote he had, you put in the book, where he talks about Bonham's ability to listen and be smart about when it's time to do a drum fill. And that is really important, because there could be those gratuitous, like, look at me, look what I can do, drum fills, but to place it just where it needs to be. I would imagine that's not that easy. You have to have a certain feel. We mentioned that.
You have to have a real musical sense beyond just a talent at the drums. This is also something that people said about Dave Grohl decades later, you know, that he had this just incredible ability to not just come in and play loud and aggressively and give Nirvana this newfound intensity. He also had this great sense of like, not only could he play amazing fills, but he knew where to put them and like knew like how to design a fill so it wasn't just an improvised thing, but it was a thought through kind of composed idea. And with him, it's kind of obvious, and that's a compliment. You know, he's chapter 14 in the book. I love him as a drummer. But you can tell, like in Nirvana songs, that these you can drum along to them, like he had their real parts. Bonham was a little bit more loose like that, but he absolutely had the same. I mean, he was so alive to everything else that the other musicians were doing. And Plant, I mean, that was the main thing he talked about. You know, he talked about him being a great, impressive drummer, but he talked about just like as a band, they were just so unbelievably powerful and just like really mind melded in an amazing way.
Going back to Power Station, you had some comments from John Taylor, who was in the Power Station with Tony Thompson. That was a super group, by the way, for those who may not know. Robert Palmer, Tony Thompson, along with Andy and John Taylor from Duran Duran. Now, John told you it wasn't a comfortable experience recording with Tony. What did he mean by that? Did they not get along, or was it more of a musical?
I think so. So that group came together, and yeah, I spoke to John Taylor, and I have to say, I've told this to many people, just like personally, but on the record, John Taylor is one of the greats. Like, this guy was really one of the coolest, most insightful musicians I've ever spoken to, in his way to talk not only about music, but in his way to talk about musicians and their personalities. And so what he was talking about there was that, like, by the time Duran Duran and Chic met, they were both wildly popular, but Duran Duran was like influenced by Chic. So they like revered those guys, and the Chic guys sort of respected the new sort of upstart pop guys. So they met, like when this supergroup started, it was this total excitement about like meeting there. It was kind of playing with a hero was the essential, it was the nature of like playing, and especially with John, who plays the bass has a very, you know, direct, close relationship with the drums. So to be playing with Tony Thompson was like this great, incredible moment. And it wasn't anything to do with them not personally getting along. It was more just sort of like when he got close to that power, when he got close to that drumming, and he played alongside it, he realized that there's a real sort of like it's not just that it feels intense, like it is intense. Like it was almost like physically uncomfortable to have this guy just kind of like, you know, beating the music forward against you. And also that he recognized that this came from a really real place, that it wasn't like Thompson was a depressed or angry guy at all, But he said about all the guys in Chic, who were black men born in the 1950s, like they saw crazy stuff and they overcame crazy stuff, and they came up in the middle of the civil rights movement. And so it wasn't so much that they were like, it wasn't that they personally disagreed. It was just like fascinating for him to come and see the guys from Chic, this great fun band, and realize that they're really not happy-go-lucky guys. It wasn't like they were bad dudes at all, just not happy-go-lucky. But his point was that like that's what makes that music so durable and lasting even now.
And that intensity overwhelmed him at times.
Yeah, he had this quote about it. It's like it's harder to make something about like it's harder to make fun, happy music than it is to make sad music, in the sense that like it's harder to make like lasting happy music. And his point was that like that little, just like that, in the same way that like a little bit of vinegar in the soup, just sort of adds that little tang, that little, it's just like that little bit of intensity, that underlying intensity added something really musically durable to these songs that are just like pure joy. But that's why they still sound fresh almost 50 years later.
Yeah. Well, intensity and Slayer, those two go together. Dave Lombardo from Slayer. You write, quote, "The thing that defines Slayer's evilness as much as the guitars was a bass drum technique beyond any heard in rock to that point." Okay, so let's talk about double bass drumming. What does that mean? And then what makes Lombardo so good at that?
So your typical bass drum, or your typical drum set rather, has one bass drum, which is the one on the floor, operated with a pedal, typically with your right foot. And occasionally, even pre-rock and roll, in certain jazz bands, Duke Ellington's band and others, you would have two bass drums, and that would usually be used like, it's a flashy thing. It's a thing for drummers to use it as like a kind of timekeeping in a solo, or to bring up a big kind of crowd pleaser, showmanship kind of deal. Great drummers who did that in jazz. In metal, of course, it can be used like so many things, just to sort of, as you say, like dial up that intensity. And metal drummers really grabbed on, and starting in like the 70s and leading into the 80s, really grabbed onto this idea, including guys like Phil Taylor and Motorhead. And so Slayer, guys from San Francisco, they formed their band in about 1982. And like so many metal bands, their whole thing is just like, we're out to crush the world. We're going to be the fastest, loudest, heaviest, most evil, blah, blah, blah. And so like the double bass thing just sort of becomes this natural thing that Lombardo's doing it. He starts playing in Slayer when he's like 16. He's so young, and just quickly becomes like an absolute prodigy on this double bass technique, and also uses it not just to dial up intensity, but as this band grows, I mean, he's like a true, real musician, not just like a meathead basher. And so, you can hear, even through the thudding and the volume and everything, a great deal of control that he has. And he's not always just playing loud, really musical stuff. And he's a person I didn't have any knowledge of. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. Like, I'm not by nature a metal guy, and this was one of those genres where, like, okay, if I'm going to write a history of rock and roll, it has to include certain things. So I really had to learn about the blues, for example, in a different way than I had before, and then I had to figure out how to talk about metal as a subgenre. And so again, that's another one. Like, if I've been talking about a subgenre, you might have gone to Black Sabbath to talk about like the most epochal metal band. But if you're talking about drums, suddenly a group like Slayer becomes a really fascinating sort of window to look at that genre, because that drummer, that particular player, is just so unique and frankly just impressive to me. I just love the way this man plays. He's just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and in the way that Bill Ward was influenced by jazz, you've got Lombardo influenced by Latin music. And then there's the example being Angel of Death, right? He does something.
This is another reason why I wanted to include him, was that, he brings another element to talk to, which is the sort of Latin influence on rock and roll. Surprised me as much as anybody that Slayer would be the way to talk about that. But yeah, Slayer, or rather Lombardo, was born in Cuba, came to America as a very young kid, but was raised by immigrants in a Cuban American community, and so heard a lot of Latin music live and on the stereo when he was growing up. And there was this great anecdote, again, not one, but just one that I found in a previous interview he'd done, where he talked about this very famous, like if you asked a metal drummer, what is the most famous metal drumming fill of all time, they would probably say this double bass break that he does on the Slayer song Angel of Death from their album Rain in Blood. So he does this great double bass timekeeping, and then he plays this like tom pattern over it to kick the band back in. And he said that when he recorded this and then listened back to it, and at this point he's in his early 20s, that was when he first realized, like, oh, this is that I just pulled a move right out of Tito Puente, who is like, they call him El Rey. He's the king of Latin music. Anyone who he's the first stop if you say, I want what's Latin music? What can I get into? He's an unbelievable figure. And so, yeah, so Lombardo, of all people, and he himself has been incredibly influential to metal drummers ever since, even he subconsciously was bringing this great, almost obvious to him Latin influence to his playing. And you can really tell it, I think, in the subtlety of what he plays. He's not the kind of guy who's got his hands up as high as he can get them so he can smack as hard as he can. He's not straining when he plays. He has a great sort of control and just a wonderful musical guy to watch. He's like an athlete that has to sort of master his approach.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. We did talk about Dave Grohl a little bit, but I wanted to ask you a little bit more about him, because it's interesting to find out that, hey, maybe he would have been part of Tom Petty's band, right? Because there was that SNL appearance.
He was given the opportunity to. Yeah.
How did he end up behind the kit that night?
So Tom Petty's album Wildflowers came out, I guess, a little bit after the suicide of Kurt Cobain in 1994. And there was a really great outpouring of support towards Grohl and Chris Novoselic in the aftermath of that, because Nirvana was so revered by people. And so one of those examples was that Petty, who had just parted ways with his original Heartbreakers drummer, Stan Lynch, one of my all-time favorites. Great player, great feel on those Petty singles. Oh, absolutely. But anyway, so he had recently left the band, and so they didn't officially have a drummer. And so they had a Saturday Night Live appearance, and Tom Petty invites Grohl to come in and just sit in on the drums for the 2 songs they play. And as you can imagine, Dave Grohl playing Tom Petty is like the loudest that the Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers have ever sounded.
Mike Campbell.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. But Campbell is literally like laughing as they play. And I mean, Grohl's great. He's really, needless to say, he's a super funky drummer. And so after that performance, I don't know exactly the timetable, but yeah, Petty did say, like, if you want to be the Heartbreakers drummer, come aboard. And yeah, amazingly, Grohl said no. And I say amazingly because he was like, I mean, he writes about this in his memoir. He was like incredibly honored by it, needless to say, but just pretty fascinating that he, obviously, because that was the start of the Foo Fighters from there. So it was really kind of amazing that he turned down this unbelievable opportunity. He'd been nearly homeless like a few years earlier, and now he has a chance to join Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And instead, he has the wherewithal, but also the desire to kind of step back, gather and regather himself after the tragedy, and start this whole new chapter, which is still ongoing 30 years later.
I wonder how much of an effect the fact that he is a drummer, how much that influences his songwriting. Because I've heard like, for example, Eddie Van Halen, I think, talked about that, how he was trained to play on the piano, so he played the guitar kind of like a piano player.
Sure.
Yeah. So if you're thinking like a drummer, you're kind of writing music from that standpoint, maybe.
I think if we were to compare the two, and it's a fair comparison, I don't remember, but like the sort of songwriter drummer component and guitar player component for Grohl has always been like a little bit more intertwined than his career makes it seem. Like in public, he was a drummer in the most famous rock band in the world, and then suddenly made this pivot to guitar playing and singing and songwriting. And the truth is that like he recorded like one-man band albums when he was a kid, like
he did.
Like a literal child. And so he always had this kind of songwriter's, compositional sense, even when he was a drummer. I don't think he was ever at that time thinking he would like make his living as a songwriter. I think drumming was always the thing he was most talented at. And that was certainly like the break that he got was playing with a DC punk band called Scream. But so I think he was always drummer first, but it wasn't like Kurt Cobain died and he was like, I better pick up a guitar. They shared songwriting notes a lot. Like Grohl had, input in the composition of Nirvana songs and brought his own songs to Kurt Cobain for songwriters advice. Like,
wasn't there one song that ended up on a deluxe edition, not on In Utero?
I do believe, yeah, you're right. I forget the name of it, but I think there is one song that was officially released that was written and I think sung by Grohl as a Nirvana song.
Right.
But it was known. Like he recorded stuff during that time. I don't think he was like sitting on a warehouse of unused songs. It wasn't like the first Foo Fighters song was like his All Things Must Pass or something like that. I think that was a new sort of project in response to something, but always a highly musical, compositionally minded person from the get-go, for sure.
So to finish up, I'm curious, do you have a favorite drummer or top 3 drummers?
Oh boy. So impossible to say, but one of the people we did not mention here, because even in a great long interview like this, you can't talk about everybody, but I was really proud and excited to include Mo Tucker from the Velvet Underground in this book. I think her legacy is not as well understood as it could be, and I liked the idea of positioning her among figures like Charlie Watts and Ringo Starr and other people who are a little bit better known, because I think she really deserves to be known like for her innovations in terms of, again, talk about just sheer creativity behind, she could be the loudest, she could be the quietest, she could just anything that served that band. And I think she's so influential for that. In terms of people that really don't get mentioned in the book, I would bring up a guy named Greg Saunier from the indie rock band Deerhoof, who've been going since the late 90s. I just think he's a phenomenal player and just like so much fun, so creative and so interesting. And now I'm thinking like there's a billion names flashing through.
Oh, sure.
Because you asked for 3, of course, but I'm just trying to think of like
I think about it in terms of if it's will I listen to the song, even if the song itself isn't great, but I'll just listen for the drummer. And what comes to mind? Who comes to mind? Stuart Copeland.
Uh-huh. He was a big one.
Yeah, just to listen to him play. I can listen to his isolated tracks.
Totally. And he had great, soundtrack work and other thing. I'm not as big a fan of him as a lot of people are. And it's not like it's just personal preference, but like he and Ginger Baker were absolutely the two people that the most folks asked me about. Like, is this guy going to be in the book? So like
Neil Peart.
Neil Peart. It's interesting to see like which of these players has actually like registered in the popular consciousness, among that. When I was a kid, I loved Keith Moon a lot.
Oh, of course.
He was amazing. So I'll also say, I get into him in the introduction of the book, but, the guy who actually did end up replacing Stan Lynch long-term in the Heartbreakers was a wonderful British drummer, black guy.
Steve Ferrone.
Steve Ferrone. And he's a guy that like, not a household name, but boy, he's played with absolutely everybody. And a guy like Questlove, who's of course like an amazing drummer, but just like a music nerd extraordinaire. I believe Questlove has a snare drum that he refers to as his Steve Ferrone snare because he has it like perfectly set up to like have the same backbeat. So like that's who Steve Ferrone is. He's the kind of player that like other drummers just like listen and like just get obsessed
super
with.
Super tight. I mean, Tom Petty, I think the first song I think he may have played on Steve Ferrone was You Don't Know How It Feels, or one of the, at least that was the moment where Petty's like, this is my guy. And it's real interesting to talk about how a change in drummer can change the sound of an artist. The songs that Tom Petty wrote with Ferrone, they're different from what we heard, pre-Ferrone. And, that's the impact that a drummer can make.
He's a great example, too, of a guy who, because, of course, he played the class. I mean, say what you will about Ferrone. I don't think he played on, like, the most popular Tom Petty. He didn't play on the classic Tom Petty and the Heartbreaker songs. I guess he played on Wallflowers, which people love. But for many decades, you got to hear him play those songs. And it's like, yeah, I give all respect to Stan Lynch, who I thought put an incredible flavor on those early Petty tracks. And now you get to hear a guy like Ferrone, who just is so different, and you can really feel the difference in the way that band sounds with just that one replacement just makes all the difference, like you say.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. Well, this was fun to talk about all the great drummers, John. I really was looking forward to this. I love the book, Backbeats, A History of Rock and Roll and 15 Drummers. It's out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. Look for it at your nearest bookstore. Go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore. Look for one there. And where can people find you online?
Probably the best place is just to go to my website, johnlingan.com, JOHNLINGAN. This is my third book, so you can learn about the older ones too. They're about music as well. All my articles and stuff are there. So that's the place to go. But this was a blast, man. Great talk. Really fun to go through all this stuff.
Outstanding. Yeah, John, thanks again, and we'll hopefully have you on again down the line.
Can't wait. Thank you, Eric.
That's it. It's in the books.